So thank you very much, Ms. Alger, for a very kind introduction. I hope you can all hear me as I get closer to the mic. And thank you for joining me this evening. So not only for joining me this evening, but also for joining me on a real, what will turn out to be hopefully a voyage of discovery with the world's Wellderly. As we discover blue zones together, but we won't just discover the blue zones. You know, I think it's only apt that, given the fact that we are at the Russell Museum of Science and Innovation and History and Innovation, that as we go through this series of voyages, we also talk about history and art and literature, and we'll make frequent references to this as and when sort of the occasion presents itself. So there is a treasure map for this voyage. The treasure map involves hopefully reaching the shores where we can celebrate the one thing that every living human being on the planet is doing right now continuously. And that one thing is aging. I have a familiar face in the front row who says that I might not be doing it, but I very much am. And you know, I think it is something that we need to really take a look at how it's sort of perceived. How do we perceive it as individuals? How does society perceive it? How does the healthcare system perceive it? So the healthcare system, you know, and sort of talking to my colleagues here at the hospital and then just in general, across Mass General, perceives it something like this. So one, they tell us that, as we know, we're aging nationally. Over the next 20 years, 132 million people would have crossed the age of 50. And by year 2030, 1 in 5 of us will be above the age of 65. In 2040, 1 in 8 of us will be above the age of 75. So we are very surely and rapidly an aging population. As we age, I think the other thing that concerns all of us individually is that not only are we aging, the number of medical conditions that we have, medical comorbidities, is also increasing. I think medical science has been excellent at helping us live longer, and in many cases better. But the enemies that we face now in terms of medical disease are different than they were, let's say, a century ago, or 50 years ago, or maybe even 15, 20 years ago. And how are we sort of going to address this over time? The other way that a lot of, you know, I guess medical colleagues or healthcare system colleagues in Washington, D.C. and public health policy perceive this is that they use this term, the silver tsunami. And it conjures up the image of a, you know, sort of very, you know, daunting, negative sort of perspective. Is that the only image there needs to be, though? Some might say yes. If we talk about this at an individual level for all of us, we ask the cat in the hat on aging, the cat in the hat might say this. It might say, I cannot see, I cannot pee, I cannot chew. And then I've had to really redact and edit a lot of this, as you can imagine, because aging apparently evokes a lot of strong emotions. But you basically ask, oh my God, what can I do? My memory shrinks, my hearing stinks, no sense of smell, I look like hell. My mood is bad, can you tell? My body's drooping, the golden years have come at last. And then he says something else about the golden years. So there's that sort of, again, sort of very negative perspective, which I think a lot of us, as we go through aging at any stage of our lives, feels in a very acute sort of way. So we have a definition of aging, right? Who is older, who is geriatric, where does this retirement age of 65 come into being? You know, why 65? So Otto von Bismarck is, I hold him sort of directly responsible for this. He's a Prussian general who asked his advisors, you know, how can I bolster the Prussian economy? And his advisors, his general said, well, there are a lot of officials, government officials in Prussia, who are above the age of 65. So if you made an arbitrary age retirement cutoff at say 65, we wouldn't have to pay their salaries anymore. So Otto von Bismarck, you know, so the benevolent leader that he was, said, oh, that sounds like a fine idea. And he went ahead and did that. Now, ever since then, we've held the age of 65 as our retirement age, and every society has sort of followed suit, and we've followed suit as well. But it's interesting to sort of consider the source, and we'll dwell on it very briefly. So Otto von Bismarck is also an individual who said, "Not by speeches and votes of the majority are the great questions of time decided, but by iron and blood." So how reliable is this gentleman to sort of commit a whole generation and future generations of people to retirement age? I'm not so sure, right? In the modern day, do people, thought leaders of today, would they agree with him? Well, they might. Many of you may have read Being Mortal by Atul Gawande, who's a friendly surgical oncologist right across town at the Brigham and Women's Hospital. And I didn't read this book for a long time. And the reason I didn't read it was I thought it was more about something that has been talked about a lot recently, right? There's a lot of focus on helping people die with dignity. What should those final years look like? How difficult those conversations are. And those are all very important conversations to have. And so I thought, well, I sort of, do the geriatric side of it, and I'm more interested in celebrating the success of aging. But eventually I sort of, my curiosity got the better of me and I read it. And it's interesting that Dr. Gawande also says in the same book, the first half of it is essentially about a very different series of conversations. And he says, and I quote, "Our ultimate goal, after all, is not a good death, but a good life to the very end." Right? So it's a little bit different tone from, sort of the negative specter of the silver tsunami. And so I know of certain individuals who, Dr. Gawande may or may not agree with Otto von Bismarck. I know of certain individuals who most definitely would disagree with him. So there's this gentleman who you saw perhaps on posters and emails that went out for this talk. Now, regrettably, or I should say fortunately and unfortunately, some of you in the audience know me through the Senior Health Clinic. But if that had not been the case, I would have claimed that I looked like this about 2 weeks before, sort of giving you this talk, and I took a magic potion that allowed me to sort of age successfully, but that is not the case, and this is a stock photo of no one that any of us knows. But certainly a photo worth a million words, and a figure or an image of someone who is robust and happy and fulfilled and has contentment on his face. And so he might not agree that, it's with Otto von Bismarck's age 65, because he is in his 8th or 9th decade and doing very well, thank you very much. Now, closer to a real life example of one of my own patients who last May turned 100. And not only did she turn 100, but she did so while doing this at this place correctly. So you can see that, not only is she reached 100, but she's continuing to dance her way into, hopefully the next decade and beyond that, right? So another person who has become very close to our hearts and closer to home is Kathleen Switzer. She was the first lady to participate in the Boston Marathon. And as you can see in the black and white photos behind her, she was at that time forcibly, they tried to force her out of the race. And she said, well, she stuck to her guns and she completed the race as the first woman who had ever run the marathon. Well, she broke another barrier more recently. She ran the Boston Marathon again at age 70. And so again, successfully breaking several myths and shattering several barriers. How do we feel about it? Remember I started talking about healthcare system and how do we feel about this aging demographic and what we can do about it. And is it true that every medical provider sort of feels that the elderly or the elderly are proving us wrong? Or are there people who actually support this phenomenon and actually celebrate the success of this aging? Well, again, being at the Universal Museum, we don't need to look farther than our own history.
Yes, sir.
There is, fine example in the father of geriatrics at the Mass General Hospital. So Kenneth Meinecker, who was my mentor and founder of our geriatrics unit, who would probably disagree with Otto von Bismarck as well, because he always sort of taught all of us that aging is something to be celebrated, and that we really haven't found the panacea, and until we do, we can by no means sort of throw in the towel and just sort of just assume that it is what it is, and there's nothing more that can be done about it the way things are. And so he constantly sort of challenged the status quo. I mean, he's passed away 2 years ago now, but we remember him fondly for the pioneering presence that he had. Question, though, that may be crossing many of your minds is, how much of this secret sauce is in our genes? And so, before we even ask that question, we've used this term loosely a little bit so far in the talk, Wellderly. Who are they? How is science define them? How can we define them? And so, turning to science, we say the Wellderly are exceptional individuals who live into their 9th decade and beyond, without developing a significant chronic medical condition. And also those who are not on a whole bunch of medications, or on very few medications. The gentleman who came up with this definition is Dr. Eric J. Topol, who is the director of the Scripps Translation Science Institute. And what Dr. Topol is, he's famous for a lot of things, but one thing that he is famous for in terms of Wellderly are, he published this journal article in world-renowned journal Cell, where he looked at whole genome sequencing of the healthy aging cohort with his group of researchers. So, drilling down into that a little bit of how that applies to all of us, he focused on something that a lot of studies haven't focused on. Most studies on aging have focused on people who live for the longest amount of time possible, so they're longevity studies. But they don't really make a distinction between people who are just living a long time and beset by multiple chronic medical conditions and taking a lot of medications and undergoing a lot of procedures and treatments, versus those folks who are aging well into their 9th decade and beyond, but are the Wellderly, per his definition, who are not beset by a lot of medical disease. And he's a scientist who's interested in genes and genetics, and so he said, well, my hope is to find a gene or a set of genes that protect the Wellderly. And if we can find that in today's world, we might be able to do some genetic engineering where we could transfer these genes to all of us, hopefully one day, so that we can all age gracefully and become Wellderly. So he did a study where he looked at, remember he's talking about a group that is in their 9th decade and doing well, right? So he's excluding a lot of people who have a lot of chronic medical conditions, right? And he's comparing them to a group that it doesn't meet that definition, or who have a lot of conditions. So he looked at 1,354 Wellderly, and the age range that he put was 80 to 105. Regrettably, he couldn't really achieve what he set out to achieve, so there was no major single genetic contributor to healthy aging identified. What he did see was that there was a significant decrease in the genetic risk of 2 entities, Alzheimer's dementia and cardiovascular disease. And he found 2 genes, ApoE4 and POL25A1, which are both genes that we see in patients who have Alzheimer's dementia, so he lent some support to that. But he looked at a lot of other things too, remember. He looked at the incidence of a lot of different diseases and sort of, is there a genetic protection to other entities like cancer or diabetes or stroke? And he didn't really find any protection against those entities. So if you think about that, if there's no genetic protection, remember this is just one study, and by his own admission he says that he is doing much larger studies and continuing this study onwards. But if there wasn't any genetic protective factor for the entities that I mentioned, the Alzheimer's and heart disease and the stroke patients, there must be something else that protected these folks. And if it wasn't genes, what was it? Is it something that is in our control? Intriguing question, right? So if you read this study, one is sort of the obvious thing that I've already mentioned. Alzheimer's, coronary artery disease, maybe had a protective effect, but look at how many things on that table didn't have a genetic protective effect. So, reading a research study is one thing, but drilling down deeper, you uncover some real pearls, which maybe the original researcher wasn't really looking for. but just happened to chance upon. So when he looked at the Wellderly cohort, he also saw some very interesting patterns emerge. One pattern that he saw was that, yes, the Wellderly were older than, the population that he was comparing it to, but they also weighed less. They exercised more. They had more, they had more education over time than people who did poorly and were not part of the Wellderly group. So hold on to those sort of patterns and thoughts, and we'll return to them. So let's cross the genetic divide just for a moment, okay? And I'll just sort of go down a little bit of a different path. If you're looking at humans and trying to figure out how much of this is genetic and how much of this is environmental, does it hold true for other species? We're not alone on this planet. They've been living organisms that have been here before us. And it turns out that, in fact, that's true. We all age, as species, we all age differently. There are certain species in this planet that age, but they age much slower. Much, much slower, it turns out. So our friends, I should say, the lobster, the turtle, the whale, and clams, they all age much more slowly than we do, if at all, right? Because they live to several hundreds of years sometimes. And then our friend, the salamander, who's right in the thick of things, well, it has the ability to regenerate parts of its body if they're cut off. Can we learn a lesson from that? Is there a lesson for us to learn? And is there a common link that binds all of these species? Because, boy, if we could find that, well, then maybe we could look back at humans and say, is there something that can help us here? Right? And there turns out that something that links, the amphibians and the crustaceans and the mammals and the reptile on this picture is something called telomeres. Now, telomeres what are they? So they are a series of proteins, repeated nucleotide bases or proteins at the end of our chromosome. Every single pair of chromosomes that encodes genetic material has this right at the very tips, and you can see that in the picture to your right. And what's their role? Well, they're there for a reason. They're there to protect that genetic material from degradation. So as a cell divides in the body, they tend to protect that cell, but in doing so, they use up a little bit of themselves, so they shorten a little bit. And so no cell can divide forever, right? So there's a number of times that any cell in the body can divide, and it's called Hayflick's number, so it can divide about 50 to 70 times. And every time that the cell divides, the telomere shortens a little bit in an attempt to protect that DNA. Well, eventually what happens is that while we start off with the telomere base length being about 15,000 base pairs, every year the telomere keeps on shortening as we are growing, right? So at conception, we're about 15,000 base pair lengths for the telomeres. When we die, we're down to about 5,000 base pairs. So at a certain time point, when the telomere is short enough and can no longer shorten any further, what happens to the cell? The cell stops dividing because the telomere is no longer protecting it. So in effect, what the telomere is doing is that it's determining, in part, our biological and our chronological age. It's also being linked to a host of different sort of diseases, and I'll tell you how. But what's really interesting is there's certain triggers that can shorten the telomeres faster than at other times. And what are those triggers? Smoking, obesity, stress, psychological stress. All of these can shorten the telomere at a faster clip, which means that they might make us age faster as well. Now look at it, sort of on the flip side, right? The converse of it. Fine, we have a protective friend here in the telomere. So if we have a friend and an ally that nature has given us, could we find a way to extend the telomere, protect it from getting shorter? And maybe there is a way, but before we can get there, we need to find out how the telomere actually works, right? What is that entity? What is that enzyme that can protect and preserve it? And so a group of scientists got together to find out exactly how we could do that. And they found a substance that could protect the telomere itself. And that substance was the substance telomerase. So in 2009, this group of 3 scientists, Drs. Blackburn, Grider, and our very own Dr. Sustak, who is actually it was based at Mass General, they won the Nobel Prize in Physiology and Medicine in 2009 for discovering this telomerase enzyme. And why did they win the Nobel Prize? Because the scientific community knew that maybe this was a breakthrough. Maybe if you protected the telomeres by replicating the effect of the telomerase, could we finally have a cure for aging? So Dr. Blackburn wrote a book on this. She called it the telomere effect. And then the other effect that she didn't put in the book, but which I can share with you, is that when she went to the ceremony in Oslo for her Nobel Prize in Medicine and Physiology, she got to sit next to some very interesting characters. Some of them a lead singer of a very famous band called U2. So you can see how scientists and artists sort of can be honored sort of together. But very happy, and there's a lot of hope. And from this hope, there's another scientist, Bill Andrews, who said, now I'm going to pick up from where these folks have left off, and I'm going to see whether we can put this telomerase in a pill form. And he came up with this pill and called it, for want of a better term maybe, Product B. And his postulate, this isn't talking about time between 2010 and 2014, was that he could mass produce this pill and sort of give it to people and sort of stop them from aging. Except for 2 things. There's always except for something, right? What about this? Remember I told you that the cells naturally have an upper limit. They stop dividing after a certain time point. Well, what if we gave people telomerase inhibitors and we said, that's great, the telomere can now sort of keep on dividing, as much as possible. It can extend for as long as possible. Well, that means the cell will continue to divide. And a cell that continues to divide uncontrollably is essentially a cancer cell, right? So a lot of people sort of said, wow, is this going to cause more cancer? And rightly so. The image that you see on your right, beautiful as it may seem, is actually a dividing lung cancer cell. And remember we said how stress can promote the shortening of telomeres, so that's our enemy in this sort of aging process. Well, we've all been through, I think, some amount of psychological stress, but none more so than individuals who've been involved with the election last fall. So before the election, they sort of look like this. And they probably have the resources to get their hands on Product B and take it and prevent aging, but they didn't quite, I think, make it. So, people on the left don't look like that anymore. The person on the right I was surprised by is our current president. So, I guess he's smiling, so, better days, happier days. But let's translate over to something else. Remember I talked about different species, and so if the answer is not in our genes, and the answer is not in the telomeres, could the answer be in a substance in our bloodstream? So, scientists being scientists, they said, you know what, we're going to look at that, and we're going to look at that in mice, thankfully, where they found, old mice and younger mice, and they connected them together. They connected their circulatory systems together, and they transfused blood from the older mouse to the younger mouse. Now, the older mouse they knew had a bad heart, had an old heart that was stiff, and had a lot of what we call myocardial hypertrophy, so large, stiff cells. The heart didn't pump quite that well. And they connected the younger mouse to it, who had a brand new sort of, very nimble sort of heart, eating well and pumping blood out at, sort of the normal rate. And they found over time that the older mouse actually got the new, or the younger heart from the younger mouse. So its heart started to resemble that of the younger mouse. And they came up with a factor, growth-derived factor, which they said, well, maybe this is the link. Well, those studies are still ongoing, but remember I talked about species and how we can borrow from them? Well, we can, but the translation from mice to human beings lends us to the, sort of sad truth that mice and men are very, very different, right? And so John Steinbeck knew that. And when we were talking about mice, we were invariably talking about cheese, and so Spencer Johnson sort of wrote this book, Who Moved My Cheese? He's talking about old ideas and young and new ideas, right? And so that is still an idea in progress, but there might be newer ideas. And as Spencer Johnson said, he said, the quicker you let go of old cheese or old ideas, the sooner you might be able to find new cheese. And so what is that new cheese? What is that new idea that is giving us hope? Because remember, all the factors that we've talked about so far, the genes, telomeres, and then the blood circulation system, are not feats that we currently in science are able to sort of have control over as individuals as we would want to be. Right? They're not talking about a missing link here. And that missing link, when you look at human studies, is the environment. So there have been a lot of twin studies that have been done. So twins, fraternal twins or other twins, who share a common genetic pool. But when those twins are separated at birth, for whatever reason, and grow up into completely different environments, it turns out that their outcomes are very different. Their health is very different, and a whole host of other outcomes are very different. And so, the interesting thing is that people have been looking at these studies for a long time, borrowing from our own sort of, wonder of nature, twins and triplets and beyond. So Daniel Postuma in Nature Genetics in July 2005 did a great service to all of us, which is she looked at all the studies that had been done up until that time, sort of between 1958 to 2012. And there had been about 2,748 twin studies done by that time. So they were looking at 14.5 million twin pairs, which is astounding that people have been looking at it for that long. And trying to see what the data showed, like how much of this was genetic and how much of it was environmental. What they found was very striking. Genetics only accounted for about 49% of those outcomes. 51% of those outcomes were determined by the environment, or things that they couldn't explain by genes. There's a more recent Danish population-based Swedish study with Christensen and also the Danes and the Swedes cooperated with each other on this and came to a common consensus that they thought the genetic contribution was even lower, 10 to 20%. So even if we say the environment is contributing 51% or 80%, that's quite a contribution, right? So the other thing that we should talk about, and again going back to history, is that there's a gentleman, again right here at Mass General, by the name of Dr. E.A. Cotman, who came up with this novel idea back in the 18th century. And his novel idea was he went to the surgeons at Mass General and he said, you know what, we should really start sharing with patients outcomes for every surgeon in the hospital, right, our hospitals in Boston, and seeing which surgeons have good outcomes, which surgeons have bad outcomes, and if we share that data, then patients get to decide who they see, right? They go to the surgeon who has the best outcomes. And at that time, today it seems perhaps, very logical thing to do. The response was interesting. Remember, we're talking about our own institution here at Mass General. So Dr. Cotman expected that perhaps he'll be, facilitated for this and, lauded for this. Instead, they found that he was shunned. He was forced out of practice, and his only crime really was that he was ahead of his time. So in frustration at the surgeon community, he commissioned this cartoon, which is now commissioned in terms of, Harvard has honored him as the Back Bay golden goose or ostrich. And what it showed was that, he likened medical science at that time to an ostrich with its head in the sand, ignoring certain self-evident entities in front of them that were part of the future, but they were consciously choosing to ignore it. I feel like we're at that point of time now, where we're choosing to ignore the data that's in front of us. This is scientific data so far that I've presented to you, which points very clearly and cries out for us to investigate what that environmental entity is. And so there's a gentleman by the name of Dan Buettner, who's not a physician, but he, this piqued his interest, this environment sort of link, and he said, look, what I'm going to do is I'm going to set out an expedition. It's sponsored by the National Geographic, so he works for National Geographic. We're going to find the areas in the world with the most number of centenarians, areas of the world where people are living the longest, and also areas of the world where they're the healthiest. And he, sort of very fortuitously found that those areas sort of overlapped. And he identified 5 areas in the world that had both of these qualities. So they're very diverse. They range from Okinawa in Japan to Ikaria in Greece, Sardinia in Italy, the Nicoya Peninsula in Costa Rica, and a community of Seventh-day Adventists in Loma Linda, California. And remember, he was not only looking at the world's most number of centenarians who inhabit these places, but he was also looking at people who had the lowest rates of medical disease and morbidity. And if you think about these places that I just put up, the majority of these places are not places that have the highest quality or level of healthcare facilities in the world. And yet, so despite that, they seem to have some sort of magic that was unfolding for him, right? And he came up with commonalities that these 5 places have. What was common about such diverse cultures in the world? He came up with 9 principles. I've distilled them down to 7. And I want to talk to you about what Dan Buettner found, but also couple that with what we know from the scientific literature and how that reinforces what Dan's observations were at that time and have continued since. So, sequentially going through the principles, one thing that he found was that all of the Wellderly in these populations, because essentially that's where they were, right, by definition, they were all had some form of exercise, but they were moving naturally. The interesting thing was that they weren't going to the gym. There were not a lot of gym goers in these populations. Turns out there were not a lot of gyms in several of these areas, right? But they had aerobic exercise built into their day-to-day routine, which is great news for me because I was like, wow, sort of another excuse not to go to the gym. But how were the Sardinians getting their exercise in, right? So they live in rocky terrain, on homes that are vertically built on these rocky cliffs. And as we'll see, they are very socially interconnected. So there's a lot of, visits that they do to family and friends. And they have to traverse really treacherous terrain. Now they're used to it because they're born there and brought up, and for them it's a way of life. But there's very little automation in that rocky terrain. And so they resort to a lot of walking. They all have gardens. Some of them have bicycles, right? And so they're getting that in their day-to-day routine. The Okinawans in Japan, well, in their culture, you sit on the floor. And so just by virtue of that and getting up and greeting people or going about their day-to-day routine, they were getting up and down from the floor level 30 to 40 times a day. Seventh-day Adventists were actually, setting time aside every week for nature walks. And we'll see how that can have a therapeutic, relaxing effect itself. But we see some of that around us, right? We've heard of similar sort of things. Tai Chi, yoga, very much on the same principle. All aerobic exercise, not a single weight being lifted there, but helps us relax and perhaps helps us, attain the one of the principles of the Wellderly in the blue zones. And if you also look at a modern day technological marvel, the Fitbit. Fitbit doesn't care how you get those steps in, as long as you get them in. You could get them in on a treadmill in a gym, or you could get them by ditching your car and walking, to the Russell Museum. Not in rain, but bring an umbrella. But you can certainly, there is a way. So I like how it's sort of feasible, right? It gives all of us, including myself, a lot of hope. Purpose is the other thing that he found. So the second principle. So the Okinawans have a name for this, ikigai. Everything sounds so much more profound in Japanese, so I like to use these terms. And it literally translated is the reason for which I wake up in the AM. And so Siri needs, purpose as well. And it's a sense of purpose, right? And so these individuals, as the Blue Zone researchers called it, unlike Siri, are rewired, not retired. It's fascinating, in our geriatric primary care practice, I can give you several anecdotes, but scientific data proves this, that the time of life where we are, one of the times of life where two times where we're most vulnerable to illnesses, developing new illnesses. One is when we're born in the early years of life, and the other time of life when we're very vulnerable is when we retire. And perhaps we lose our sense of purpose because we don't think about what are we going to do after retirement, right? Well, in all of these blue zones, the Sardinians had a very defined role. They were sought after as people who had experience and wisdom, and they had a very defined role in their society. So they were busy, advising a lot of the younger folks from the benefit of the richness of their experiences. In the Seventh-day Adventists, going to the actual Wellderly, there's a lady who's aged 104 who is still volunteering in 5 different organizations, still driving with no concerns at all. There's a cardiothoracic surgeon, who supposedly should be retired, still operates at age 97. Completely accredited, right? And so these are not people who are taking risks or harming anyone. These are people who just mentally said, we keep our bodies in shape, we could do this, right? One more thing that I'll say about Ikigai is it's a great intersection between what we love, what we're good at, what the world needs, and what we can be paid for. And when I say paid for, I don't just mean it in the monetary sense, because that's probably not as fulfilling as how we can be paid for in the satisfaction of being able to contribute meaningfully, and in the appreciation of those who we're benefiting, right? And the respect that engenders. So, downshift is the principle number 3, is how Blue Zones people call it. I call it rest and recreation, R&R. And it's interesting how people relax in different ways in different cultures. The important thing is that they do take the time to, deliberately and consciously do it. Because if you think about your own selves, we live in an age of dramatic distraction, right? And the age of dramatic distraction is the computer screen that I'm looking at, the internet, the phone, email. Always busy, we're always doing something. It has a lot of, benefits, don't get me wrong, but it is still a distraction. So how many times do we take the time to sort of say, look, I'm just going to focus on myself. I'm just going to try and consciously and deliberately relax. So they do it in different ways, as I said. The Japanese, they venerate their ancestors. They get together, and that gives them a lot of joy and relaxation. They feel good in remembering those who've gone before. The Sardinians are the other end of the spectrum. They just say, well, happy hour worked for us. We're just going to continue with that. All the power to them, absolutely. That's something that we can do. The Igorians, they had their afternoon siesta. A lot of these blue zones had that, where people sort of take the time to relax. They get up in the evening and they dance. They have coffee with their friends. The Seventh-day Adventists actually have a time in the week where it's their Sabbath, so from Friday evening sunset to Saturday sunset, they try to forget everything about the stresses of worldly life and just focus on spirituality and on each other. And so, 2 things that you see on the right of your screens. In the top panel, you see the Scream, a painting by Van Gogh, where it represents a state of mind. And we're talking about the mind. You've all heard about this phenomenon that is swept through our country, mindfulness, striving to focus on the present. I've tried this, it's not that easy, focusing on your own rate of breathing and sort of excluding everything else that's going on. And we're getting worse at it. So there's another thing that could give a sense of purpose to help people who don't know any better, right? The younger folks for whom texting is a way of communication, right? That's how they were born and grew up. To let them know that there was a different time, which many of you may be familiar with, or some of us, sort of maybe more familiar with, where things can be different. It's up to us to sort of switch a lot of these things up and really focus. There is a scientific basis to this, right? So when the mind wanders, remember going back to the telomeres, we see that the telomeres shorten. When we look at mothers of chronically ill children, we see that their telomeres are shorter. Stress is a very real entity. It's the most underrated thing in medicine, according to me, because we don't spend enough time talking about it. We might spend enough time talking about your blood pressure, but what's causing your blood pressure to be high? Oh, well, it must be you. It must be the salt that you ate or the exercise that you didn't do. But what about the psychological stress? What about the friends that I'm losing over time? What about the solitude? What about every time I have ache and pain, I fear for the worst? Because, of course, then that's natural. How much time do we spend talking about that? UC Davis, there's a study that came out of it where they did a very good thing that I would have loved to be part of. They sent everyone to a mountain in Colorado and asked them to meditate. Looked at their cells, and they showed that they slowed cell aging. And above all, I think the primacy of humor, sense of humor. I can tell you that from my patients during the 9th decade and are part of the Wellderly. You see Patch Adams there, Robin Williams, very tragic transition and passing. But even in his death, what a lesson he left for us, right? The person who made all of us laugh was himself depressed and a victim of this very real and formidable foe that deserves our attention and deserves to be beaten, right? So let's talk about the eating, right? So all of the blue zones, I can tell you, they're big foodies. So that's again good news for me. But they do it with style and they do it with substance. So the Okinawans, they have this saying by Confucius, which is Hari Hachibu, another Japanese sort of saying, which is an 80-20 rule. So basically, they say eat until you're 80% full. How do they do that? They eat in smaller plates. And this is a conscious decision, right, that they've made culturally. They serve at the kitchen counter, wherever the food is being prepared. They don't serve at the table. So it does two things to my mind. One, it incorporates that aerobic exercise to give you a stimulus to get up and go for seconds. And maybe it acts as a deterrent as well. So maybe you're less likely, I'll just eat what's on my small plate and wait to move out of the blue zone. But they eat a lot of tofu as well, right? And plant-based diet is also a feature of the Sardinians and the Icarians. They subsist on a Mediterranean diet, which has proven cardiovascular benefit. So legumes, lentils, beans, nuts, leavened bread. Not a lot of processing going on. There's a plant slant, as Dan Buettner likes to call it. Food sources from plant-fed animals. And they have moderate amounts of alcohol, so wine and five. So that's not a license to sort of, excess, but moderation. The Seventh-day Adventists, they derive their diet from teachings of the Bible, and specifically the parts which talk about legumes, seeds, green plants. So things that we are more familiar with, but I think the strategies are even more interesting. What's also interesting is, again, as we cross the species divide and look at other species. Now, interestingly, human, for obvious reasons, we haven't been able to do these studies in humans, but they have done this in animal species who are starving or close to starvation. And you would think that those species survive less. They, in fact, when they're close to starvation but not quite at that stage, they actually increase their longevity by 30%. Fasting triggers a gene sirtuin, which in turn stimulates resveratrol. It's found in red wine. Red wine, a little bit of red wine can be good for you, promote your good cholesterol. Research remains controversial on this, as the American College of Cardiology comes out with conflicting statements from time to time. But it goes to show you that, again, this is where environment and science and genetics is intersecting to our advantage. We're still eating wisely, but maybe we're eating smaller portions. So the next three principles, I think, are closest to my heart. In all the blue zones, these principles endured, okay? They put family first. So in every single one of the blue zones, familial generations were either living with each other or adjacent to each other. Now, that health benefits for both the elderly and for children in those communities. For children, grandchildren, great-grandchildren. What was the benefit for the elderly? Well, there was respect for the elders, right? As I said, in Sardinia, they had these key advisory positions in traditional setup, so they felt sought after. And when they did so, there was a sense of giving back. So again, tapping into ikigai, or the sense of purpose. Remember, all of these things are not mutually exclusive. They all overlap. And if there's symbiosis between the different principles, that's terrific. And you know, the most interesting thing was that people that they were contributing to were their future generations, right? So, you know, all of you can tell me, I've only started to find out from my little daughter, our first child, who's 10 months old, and I love this saying, which I think, you know, sort of describes her well, how her little hands have stolen my heart and her little feet have run away with it. And everyone told me that that would happen, but boy, there's magic in that. And so that renewal of energy and commitment and sense of purpose was all because they put family first. They also put friends first, right? So Dan Buettner calls it belonging to the right tribe, and drills it down to cultural constructs that support it. So the Okinawans have this group of 6 friends who stay with them from childhood throughout life. And these are friends that, you know, sort of share their joys and their tribulations. They are their own face-to-face social support network. The picture that you see is actually from Dan Buettner's work. The 6 Malay that you're seeing in that picture are all ladies, the youngest of whom is, I think, 98, the oldest of whom is 105. And they've been together all their lives, right? What a social support network to have. The Seventh-day Adventists have a social connectivity group as well. That's based on, it's more faith-based, but it's also based on the walking groups. Remember the nature walks that we talked about? Again, a symbiosis of being close to nature, incorporating that aerobic exercise, maybe sense of purpose, but they're doing that with their friends, with their immediate social support network. Sardinians and Icarians, we've already talked about their sense of community. And again, if you look at the science, scientific literature, and where this intersects with Dan Buettner's work, the Framingham Heart Study, which is still ongoing, has covered many generations of what the risk factors are for heart disease. We've learned so much from it. One really interesting thing from that as well is that if, you know, if one's friends are obese, the likelihood of yourself being obese is increases about 3 times. And I'd like to sort of, you know, pause to just give a social comment about this, or social commentary. We have, mostly thanks to Hollywood, advertisements, the media, being given this perfect symbol of perfection, right? The perfect form, the perfect figure, celebration of youth and vitality. And it's been challenged a lot in the world of modeling with women to sort of say, you know, are those, you know, sort of, is Kate Moss, you know, stick-thin model the ideal to strive for? And the verdict loud and clear is absolutely not. It's not healthy, right? But just generally, those are the role models that we're putting in front of not only us, but our future generations, right? And so what happens to all of us who are not like that, right? Who are not Ben Affleck, or I wish I was, but you know, I can only wish, right? We're then, you know, sort of consigned to sort of finding people who have similar human weaknesses and frailties, like we do. And we tend to hang out with each other. And then we sort of tend to get into this cycle, this vicious circle of, well, you know, well, what are you going to do today, John? Are you going to go to the gym? No, I think, you know, Ardeshir, I'm not going to go to the gym. Let's just sort of hang out and eat pretzels. And, you know, you get the picture. It just goes on and on and on. Whereas if John was telling me, I go to the gym every day, and hey, I'm 85, well, then I might, as his, you know, sort of much younger friend, say, I don't have an excuse. This is putting me to shame, right? So, interesting concept. Now, again, an intersection with Dan Buettner's work, Malcolm Gladwell, who many of you may have read, came out of his book, Outliers. How do people who outdo others sort of, how do they do it? And he opens his book with this example of this doctor by the name of Stuart Wolfe, in the 18th century, who stumbled upon this town in Pennsylvania called Rosetta. And a lot of people who had migrated from Italy in that town of migrants. And he found that they had the lowest rates of heart disease, and he was moved by what he found, so he wrote a book about it. He said, the influence of human relationships on heart disease. Human relationships on heart disease, not a cholesterol agent, not an aspirin, not a beta blocker, not a procedure, not a surgery, but human relationships. And what he found was that the Rosettans had done something very smart, and they probably didn't know that they were, you know, helping their hearts by doing this, is when they sort of migrated from Roseto in Italy. They landed up in Pennsylvania and they said, you know, we really miss home, we're really homesick. They built an exact replica of Roseto, their hometown, with multiple generations living next to each other, that tradition, that respect for elders, the familial ties, the Mediterranean diet that they brought with them. They subsisted off the land. They were sort of secluded. I remember this was the 18th century, so they said, well, we'll grow our own food, right? They were a group of farmers. And so it just goes to show you that Blue Zone principles were in play even back then. And we keep on rediscovering them all the time. They're kind of like a common thread throughout everything we do. Another thing that all of these folks found is, do we have social connectivity today? We do, but slightly in a different way. And is that good? Well, it's really good in the sense that it helps me connect with family and friend all over the world, right? So that's really good. But is it really? Does it have some ills that go along with it? And every technology has good and bad with it, right? So we must be cognizant of the bad and embrace the good. So the one study that has been sort of come out in scientific circles on Facebook sort of says that people who use Facebook tend to be more depressed. And I can sort of understand why, because I rarely ever put anything that went wrong in my day-to-day on Facebook. I usually put up stuff that I really had a good time with. Well, when I log in, I sort of say, everyone except for me seems to be having this amazing time. Now look at my life and it doesn't look that great, right? So we're losing some things in this, right? We're losing the art of letter writing. What's happening to emails that I get with spelling? You know, thank God for spell check. Can I read my own handwriting as a doctor? Maybe not. But the art of penmanship, the art of letter writing, face-to-face time, right? Actually going out and putting aerobic exercise to work, going out of the sense of purpose. I'm going to visit my friend today and generate the social links. So again, a comment more and more on society than anything else. The other thing that they found was sense of belonging, the sense of belonging, which they found in these blue zones as being faith-based and somehow linked to spirituality. It doesn't need to be in these two categories. It could be any other group. The core of it is that we get together as a group, much like we're getting together today, I suppose. And so the researchers of the blue zones found that faith-based community can add 4 to 14 years of life to the lifespan if you congregate at least 4 times a month, right? So this is, I don't know how often these evening lecture series are, but maybe a pitch for having more of this sort of thing. And we can sort of believe in the power of prayer again, but we can believe in the power more so of togetherness. Remember, it's not just that they were sort of communities that were praying, but they were praying together, right? It was bringing the Seventh-day Adventists together, it was bringing the Sardinians together, and it was bringing the Okinawans together for a different thing. It was still, you know, to honor and venerate their ancestors, as we've seen. So I love this quote: spiritual practices help us move from identifying with the ego, just ourselves, to identifying with the soul. Old age does that for you too, and spiritualizes people naturally. So, Dan Buettner's group obviously didn't stop here. We're, you know, coming to where sort of next steps and what he's doing now. He said, so inspired by the Blue Zones, you know, not only did he write a book about this, not only has he published a second book about it, but he just sort of said, can we reverse engineer cities based on that Blue Zone blueprint? I.e., can we go to cities here in the United States and say to them, here are the Blue Zone principles. Let's work with your city officials to really incorporate that into your day-to-day lives and existence. And there is a competitive selection for it. And so cities actually vied for being the city to be chosen. And the city that got chosen was Alberta, Minnesota, which is a little bit outside of Minneapolis. And the reason that they picked it was everyone from the administration to everyone in the community was very much sort of a huge fan of the Blue Zones and had very good ideas about how to implement it. So they implemented it citywide at a policy level, at an infrastructure level, in communities, in schools, in homes, their grocery stores had sections for Blue Zone foods. And they focused on something very interesting, you know, sort of again in that spirit of innovation. A 20-mile life radius around which 80% of our lives revolve. And when I think about it, maybe that's true. Maybe that's how we construct our lives. What were the results? Well, the community collectively lost 12,000 pounds in weight, collectively. Healthcare costs were reduced by 40%, and they're still continuing to collect data in terms of next steps. So as Dan Buettner and his group bring this to more and more cities, I think it leaves us with some food for thought, right? And that is, what an inspiring example where someone who's not a scientist, who's not a physician, just sort of someone who works for National Geographic, was able to go out and find all of these principles. And when I'm talking about him, and I look at the scientific literature, the science completely supports everything that he's finding, completely supports the observations of the Wellderly and the Blue Zone. Can we import or borrow from the lessons from the Wellderly? Can we bring the Blue Zone principles to our own homes and communities? I feel we can, and I hope that we can focus on this life radius as individuals, at places, stores, workplaces, restaurants, but also to really push for public policy, right? This is how we fix healthcare, not by spending gazillion dollars on the next procedure that may come through, because that's not helping us get into the zone of the Wellderly. So here are the principles once again, just in sort of a summary: moving naturally, having the right outlook, eating wisely, belonging. I hope that on the voyage of discovery that we've had, that these principles were useful, and I more so hope that we're leaving you with a superhighway to lead us to the next phase for the Blue Zones and for the Wellderly. I thank you all.